Have you ever wondered how many stories were forgotten between the lines of official history? How many secrets were buried, not by chance, but by choice? Mary Magdalene is one of those enigmas, a figure that time has transformed into something far removed from what she could have been. But what if the truth is more controversial than you imagine? What if Mary Magdalene was not just a follower, but the bearer of forbidden knowledge, excluded and censored by the early church? What would this change about everything we know about Christianity? Prepare to be immersed in a fascinating and uncomfortable journey where we explore not just the facts, but also the intentions behind them. This is an invitation to question the narratives you have always accepted as true, to look beyond the obvious and discover how power has shaped the spiritual history of an entire civilization. You will understand why Mary Magdalene was persecuted, not just for her story, but for what she represented, a threat to a system that preferred to maintain absolute control. But be careful, this is not a story for the faint of heart. As we explore these ancient texts, you will see that they not only challenge the foundations of Christianity, but also invite us to reflect on our own beliefs. And in the end, you will be faced with an inevitable question. To what extent can the truth be manipulated? Are you ready to question what you were taught and look for what was hidden? Imagine the discovery of an ancient, dusty text, stored for centuries in forgotten caves in Egypt, that directly challenges the dominant narrative of early Christianity. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, fragmented and incomplete, emerged as a whisper from time immemorial, bringing with it a latent threat to the patriarchal structure of the church. Dating from the 2nd century, Adibas, this gospel presents Mary Magdalene not as a marginal figure, but as Jesus' favorite disciple, someone who not only walked alongside the Master, but who understood mysteries that others only glimpsed. Curious, right? The question that remains is, why did the church, with so much zeal, leave these texts out of reach as if they were forbidden knowledge? The most controversial scene in this gospel is almost cinematic. Peter, the rocky leader, questioning Mary's authority. He, representing a hierarchical male model, finds himself confronted by a woman who, according to the text, received teachings directly from Jesus. There is something deeply human about this conflict, don't you think? As if to say, who are you to lead us? And Mary's implicit answer echoes through the centuries, she who knows what you dare not know. This short passage may seem simple, but it carries the weight of a power battle between old and new, between established leadership and marginalized wisdom. Now think about the cultural implications. In the context of nascent Christianity, where society already saw women as subordinates, a text that positions Mary Magdalene as a spiritual leader is, to say the least, subversive. The early church, by embracing a male hierarchy, rejected not only Mary, but everything she represented. The possibility that spirituality transcends gender. No wonder texts like hers were quickly censored and deleted. After all, a gospel that suggested equality and female empowerment was a threat to the emerging patriarchal model. It is worth highlighting that this exclusion was not a historical accident, but a deliberate movement. When we look at the history of the formation of Christianity, we see a clear pattern, centralizing authority in male figures, erasing narratives that placed women in prominent positions. Have you ever stopped to think about how many voices have been deliberately silenced? This persecution of the church's texts and female figures is not just a historical fact. It's a reminder of how power shapes history and how hidden knowledge often needs to be rescued by those who dare to question. And so, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene remains a symbol of resistance and mystery. But he is more than that. It is an invitation to reconsider everything we have learned about spirituality and leadership. What else could be buried in forgotten caves, waiting to be rediscovered? Perhaps the next fragment of this story is taking us directly to another crucial point: how Mary Magdalene transcended the role of follower to become, possibly, the spiritual mother of an alternative Christianity. Few figures in Christian history carry as many layers of mystery as Mary Magdalene. For centuries, she was relegated to the role of follower, as if she were merely on the periphery of grandiose events. But what if we look closer? Texts such as the Gospel of Mary and Pistis Sophia reveal a very different portrait. She was not a simple disciple, but someone who understood the most profound teachings, the spiritual secrets reserved for a few. In John 20-17, for example, Jesus entrusts Mary with the task of announcing his resurrection, a gesture that, for many scholars, amounts to legitimizing her as an apostle. Curious, right? Why, then, has this central position been diluted over the centuries? The symbolism of the scene in which Jesus addresses Mary after the resurrection is almost poetic in beauty. She is the first to see him, the first to hear his words. Isn't it interesting how this contrasts with the traditional narrative that Peter and the other apostles were the pillars of the church? This small interaction, almost lost in the canonical Gospels, suggests something deeper, a recognition of Mary's ability to understand the divine in a unique way. It is no surprise that Gnostic texts often position her as a recipient of esoteric knowledge, while the other apostles are more focused on power struggles. Historically, the attempt to erase her as a spiritual leader reflects the tension between two visions of Christianity. One, centered on male hierarchy and institutional authority, and another, which emphasized individual spirituality and inner knowledge. Mary Magdalene, with her symbolic connection to divine wisdom, Sophia, represented this second approach, one that obviously threatened the structures of the nascent church. Isn't it intriguing to think that she could have been a spiritual mother for an inclusive and alternative vision of Christianity? Perhaps their exclusion was more than a theological issue. It was a political movement. Furthermore, it is impossible to ignore the wealth of Gnostic texts that highlight it. While institutional Christianity opted for a unified doctrine, these works presented Mary as someone who not only received teachings, but also questioned and transcended them. She was not just a passive figure. She was active, dynamic, restless, a leader in every way. Was his audacious leadership considered forbidden knowledge because he encouraged critical thinking? After all, nothing challenges an institution more than the idea that believers can access the divine on their own. Thus, Mary Magdalene emerges as a fascinating enigma, disciple, apostle, or spiritual mother of a forgotten tradition. Maybe she's all that and more. What if, as we look more closely at its history, we are also revealing fragments of a lost spirituality, something that directly connects to the next point? What really happened during the Council of Nicaea, and how did it shape the Christianity we know today? Imagine a room full of religious and political leaders, each carrying their own ambitions, egos, and allegiances. This was the setting for the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where, under the command of Emperor Constantine, Christianity began to take the form we know today. But what is rarely mentioned is that this event was not just a theological discussion. It was a carefully orchestrated political maneuver to unify a fragmented empire. Among the decisions taken, one was particularly silent but deeply impactful: the exclusion of texts considered heretical, those that challenged official doctrine. Curious, right? Who decided what was sacred and what was forbidden? Although the Gospel of Mary Magdalene was not mentioned directly at the council, its exclusion is consistent with the rejection of Gnostic texts, which emphasized individual spirituality and self-knowledge. These ideas clashed with the centralization of religious power. After all, why would someone need an institution to access the divine if the connection was internal? The council not only selected texts that reinforced the authority of the church, but also silenced those that offered a broader and more inclusive vision of spirituality. And have you noticed how these decisions still resonate today? The exclusion of these texts was not just a doctrinal choice, but an act of control. By eliminating writings that highlighted figures like Mary Magdalene, the church consolidated a hierarchical model that marginalized women and rejected diversity of interpretations. Think about it. How much wisdom has been lost in this search for uniformity? These apocryphal texts were not just religious writings. They were windows into a rich, complex, and often censored spirituality. More than that, they show us how narratives can be shaped by power. There is also a cultural dimension to consider. During the period in which the council took place, the influences of the Roman Empire were still very present. The Roman patriarchal and militaristic vision permeated the church's decisions, reinforcing a model that already excluded women from leadership positions. Gnostic texts, which featured female figures like Mary Magdalene in central roles, were dangerous precisely because they questioned this structure. Isn't it fascinating to see how the decisions of a small group of people shape centuries of belief? And so, the Council of Nicaea was not only a milestone in the history of Christianity, but also a watershed for spiritual knowledge. But what about the texts that escaped the control of the council? Those that lay buried in caves, like the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, waiting to be rediscovered centuries later. Perhaps this is where the story begins to intertwine with the next point: the discovery of these manuscripts and the truths that the church didn't want you to know. In 1945, in a small Egyptian village called Nag Hammadi, a peasant made a discovery that would defy centuries of religious narrative. Hidden in clay jars were the manuscripts that historians call the Gnostic library. These texts, buried around the 4th century AD, included works such as the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, and other writings that emphasize self-knowledge and a direct connection with the divine. Now, ask yourself, why would anyone so carefully bury these texts? What was it about them that was so dangerous to the church? Perhaps because these writings offered forbidden knowledge, an understanding that was beyond the control of religious authorities. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts are fascinating not only for their content, but for the context in which they emerged. During the 4th century, the church had consolidated its power, labeling movements that did not align with official doctrine as heretical. These Gnostic texts, with their emphasis on the individual spiritual quest, represented a direct threat to the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Rather than relying on priests, temples, or sacraments, they suggested that each individual could access the divine spark within themselves. Of course, this idea was intolerable for an institution that based its authority on mediation between man and God. Among the jewels in this collection is the Gospel of Thomas, which features an intriguing phrase attributed to Jesus: "The kingdom is within you." This simple statement turns the idea that salvation depends on an external structure on its head. Isn't it amazing to think that these texts were almost lost forever? They were excluded, persecuted, and censored because they undermined the centralized control of the faith. The question remains, how many other treasures like these were deliberately destroyed to protect institutional power? Biblical archaeology and modern scholarship revealed that the Nag Hammadi manuscripts were not only religious, but also philosophical. They brought elements of Hermeticism, Platonism, and even Egyptian influences, painting a more complex picture of ancient spirituality. What the church described as heresy was actually a rich web of ideas that connected different cultures and traditions. If these texts had been preserved, what would Christianity be like today? Perhaps much more inclusive and less dogmatic. And so, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts are not just a testament to a censored past. They are an invitation to reconsider the role of religious authority in defining what is sacred. But as we delve into this ocean of forgotten wisdom, another mystery emerges. Why was Mary Magdalene transformed into a sinner over the centuries? Could this have been a strategy to erase his spiritual leadership? This is exactly what the next point will explore. The story of Mary Magdalene is one of the most intriguing examples of how power shapes narrative. For centuries, she was portrayed as a repentant prostitute, a woman who found redemption at the feet of Jesus. But there is something deeply strange about this interpretation. There is not a single textual evidence in the Gospels that justifies this transformation. So why, in the year 591, did Pope Gregory I decide to associate her with a sinful woman mentioned in Luke 7? Perhaps because it was more convenient to portray her as a marginal figure rather than a spiritual leader who challenged the church's emerging patriarchy. After all, erasing her authority would be easier than confronting her. This historical misrepresentation was not an innocent mistake, but a carefully calculated strategy. By fusing Mary Magdalene with other female figures from the Bible, such as Mary of Bethany and the anonymous woman who anointed Jesus' feet, the church created a hybrid character who served a specific purpose. This portrayal of Mary as a repentant sinner diverted attention from her role in Gnostic texts, where she is described as a privileged recipient of esoteric teachings. It is as if her leadership was purposely censored, while her image was degraded to reinforce a male-dominated worldview. But why so much effort to erase its leadership? Think of the cultural impact of Mary Magdalene being recognized as the spiritual successor of Jesus. This would challenge the official narrative of Peter and the other apostles as founders of the church. More than that, it would place a woman in a prominent position that, in the context of the 4th century, would be considered unacceptable. By labeling her as a sinner, the church not only marginalized her, but also erased the symbolism of her connection to the divine. Isn't it curious how so many other female figures in history suffered a similar fate? Passages like John 20:17 give a glimpse of what could have been. Jesus entrusts Mary with the task of announcing his resurrection, an act that many interpret as an acknowledgement of his authority. If this had been widely accepted, perhaps the history of Christianity would have followed a very different, more inclusive and egalitarian course. But instead, his image was shaped to serve a narrative that consolidated male power. It's almost as if her story is a mirror of the countless women whose voices have been silenced over the centuries. And so, Mary Magdalene remains a central and enigmatic figure, both in the official canon and in apocryphal texts. Her story is a reminder of how truth can be shaped by the hands of power. But what if we look beyond this imposed narrative? What would Christianity be like if Mary had led? This is a provocative question that leads us directly to the next point. Imagining a feminine theology and the transformative impact it could have had on the world. What if Mary Magdalene had assumed the central role that Gnostic texts imply? Imagine a Christianity guided by a feminine perspective, shaped by a worldview that values intuitive wisdom, compassion, and inclusive spirituality. Texts such as the Gospel of Mary and Pistis Sophia suggested their understanding of Jesus. Teachings went beyond literal interpretations, delving into hidden and deeply symbolic knowledge. What would the church be like if this approach had prevailed? Perhaps less focused on control and more on direct experience with the divine. The figure of Mary Magdalene in Gnostic texts is not just a follower, but a representative of divine wisdom, Sophia. This personification of wisdom, often described as feminine, challenges traditional notions of power and authority. If Mary had led, it is possible that Christianity would have embraced a theology that placed love and compassion at the center, rather than hierarchy and obedience. Instead of a religion built around fear and punishment, perhaps we would have a spirituality based on healing and personal growth. Furthermore, a feminine theology could have completely transformed the way we understand power. While the patriarchal model often associates power with domination, Mary Magdalene's leadership could have redefined this concept, emphasizing interdependence and mutual care. Imagine how this would have impacted not only the church, but also social and political structures throughout history. Christianity could have become a revolutionary force for equality, rather than perpetuating gender inequality. But the real question is, why was this possibility so feared? Perhaps because by placing Mary Magdalene in a leadership role, her spiritual message became uncontrollable. A theology centered on feminine wisdom challenges not only the power structures of the church, but also the cultural narratives that place women in subordinate roles. It's fascinating to think about how different the world could be if women's voices had been heard and valued from the beginning. And so, Mary Magdalene remains a symbol of what could have been, a reminder that forbidden knowledge and excluded ideas have the power to reimagine the world. But how did the Church deal with Gnosticism and its emphasis on self-knowledge? The answer leads us to the next point: the silencing of Gnostic wisdom as an act of religious control. Throughout history, whenever an idea threatened to shake up power structures, the response was predictable: silence. So it was with Gnostic wisdom, a tradition that emphasized self-knowledge and direct connection with the divine. For the early Church, this movement represented a profound risk. If each individual could access the sacred for themselves, what would ecclesiastical authority be for? Texts like the Gospel of Mary, with its emphasis on esoteric wisdom, were seen as forbidden knowledge, something too dangerous to share. After all, power lies in controlling the narrative, not democratizing it. Gnosticism was not only a religious current, but also a philosophy that promoted inner freedom. He suggested that salvation did not depend on external rituals, but on an internal awakening, a divine spark that everyone carries. This concept, as liberating as it was also deeply subversive. It is not difficult to imagine why the Church classified these texts as heretical. They not only challenged religious hierarchy, but also offered a spirituality that placed the individual above the institution. The Gnostics also viewed the creation of the world through a symbolic and allegorical lens. In Genesis, for example, the narrative of the forbidden fruit could be interpreted as an invitation to self-knowledge, and not as a sin. This perspective completely transformed the relationship between man and God. If knowledge were not something to be feared, but rather embraced, the idea of an authority that mediates this relationship would become obsolete. Isn't it curious how so many biblical passages can be reinterpreted when seen from this perspective? By banning Gnostic texts, the Church not only consolidated its control, but also erased a rich diversity of spiritual ideas. Texts such as Pistis Sophia and the Gospel of Thomas offered an alternative Christianity, where the focus was not on blind obedience, but on the search for understanding. By suppressing these ideas, the institution also shaped a culture that favored conformity, relegating everything that was different to oblivion. Have you ever wondered what else could have been lost in this pursuit of knowledge? And so, Gnostic wisdom became a distant echo, a shadow of a past in which spirituality was more plural and inclusive. But perhaps this echo is gaining strength again, challenging the narratives we were taught. And with it comes the opportunity to revisit everything that has been deleted, banned, or censored. What else can we rediscover by looking at these forgotten stories? Perhaps the answer is hidden in the texts themselves that refuse to disappear, carrying secrets that still have a lot to teach us. So what are you going to do now? How about starting by subscribing to this channel and turning on notifications? Here, each video is a piece of this larger puzzle, where we unravel mysteries, confront conventions, and bring to light what has been excluded, censored, and persecuted.